This conference will now be recorded.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about celebrating 150 years of history of Alpena from 1830 to 1870. My name is Don La Barre. I'm the Special Collections Librarian at the Alpena County George N. Fletcher Public Library. And so I work there. I've been there since last year, January in 2020. So I had an interesting start to my position. And it's always been a learning experience. So because of all that, this is one of the first programs I've been giving to the public and our community of Alpena myself. Typically in the past year or so, we've had other presenters or workshops happening virtual. So I'm excited to do this program, directly from me and kind of sharing what I've learned through our archives. So just a real quick touch base about what Special Collections is. Special Collections at the library here was established in the early 2000s as it is currently configured. And the mission of our Special Collections Department is to develop the local history collections and the Alpena County Library website into like a premier research resource that will be a significant asset in the study and teaching of cultural heritage of Northern Michigan. The focus of Special Collections for us and its website that we manage is the history of Alpena County and Northeast Michigan, and as appropriate, spreading out to the larger set of Great Lakes region, especially within our maritime collection on that larger focus. Within this framework, there's a particularly strong interest in the cultural and historical development of Alpena, and so the goal of Special Collections is to become a meaningful vehicle for interacting with the local community and a research center for all. I'm going to go skip. I had some stuff about, a little bit more about guidelines. If you ever want to learn more about our department and how we operate, you're always welcome to reach out to myself, or you can go online where you can see underneath alpenalibrary.org, you can learn a little bit more about what our organization is all about. So let's really quick, before getting started into the actual nitty gritty of the history, here are some, my fiance has really ingrained this into me, always putting the objectives of what you hope the program will be and what people will get out of it. So I'm just going to really quickly read off of this, and then after that, you won't see too much more text after this on the presentation. So I really hope that everyone that's attending this today is to really just give you a brief introduction to the events leading up to the incorporation of the city. I am by no means the authoritative historian on the subject. I'm just the Special Collections Librarian. All my information I get is from primary and secondary sources that are primarily available in our archive at the Alpena County Library. So, there are probably, if there's some questions, I'm not going to go into too great of detail about any one subject, because if I did, I could probably write a book on every single one of the slides. And we just want to have a nice quick overview of what the history is from the 30s to the 70s and 1800s. My second goal for this program is I really want to help identify key figures, people, and trends that influence the formation of the city, both short and long term, right? So both when, it was originally founded and even to today, I hope that once you come out of this program, that you'll be able to go, well, I can kind of see how that's influenced our physical landscape here, or a little bit about what the culture is and what things look like these days. I also, third, want to showcase the diversity in people, places, and cultures that influence Alpena's early days. So let's jump into it, right? So this is just a quick beginnings of the city, chronological order, a little bit of a pathway of what I'm doing and how I'm taking it. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of overlap, so I'm not going to be perfectly chronological. It's going to be kind of a bit of a blend between chronological order and a little bit of subject base too. So let's start where it kind of began, right before we were becoming a state, still a territory, and all that. So people have lived in Michigan for longer than anyone can remember, right? Before the French and British came here in the 1600s and the 1700s, Michigan was really a home to several tribes throughout. Some of Michigan's, basically the three largest tribes during contact from the 1800s on especially, are the Ojibwe, also known sometimes as the Chippewa, the Odawa or Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, or what's also sometimes referred to a little bit longer ago, the Potawatomi, right? So these three are kind of the major tribal groups throughout Michigan. There are definitely other ones as well. There are 12 federally recognized tribes out in the state of Michigan as of right now. But these are the three main ones that I'll be kind of mentioning lightly today. And these three share a common language, customs, and beliefs. And together they are known as the Anamackee or the Anishinaabe, which translates to English as the original people. When we talk about especially these three groupings, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, we're really talking about the Council of Three Fires. You might hear this being used sometimes. So the Odawa, the kind of the three fires, as they're kind of explained, as the Odawa are keepers of trade, providing food and goods to the nation. You have the Ojibwe, which are seen as the keepers of the ceremonies and song, medicine and faith. This group is entrusted with sacred scrolls and teachings. And then you also have the Potawatomi, which is known as the keepers of the fire. They're in charge of protecting and nurturing the Anishinaabe council fire. And they're charged with preserving also the tradition and culture of the Anishinaabe people. When we talk about major landmarks in Indigenous people and settlement into coming to the state, we're really going to look at two treaties that affected especially Northeast Michigan, and that is the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819 and the Treaty of Washington in 1836. You can see on this map on your screen, hopefully, it's a color-coded map of Michigan. You have blue showing the Washington Treaty of 1836, and you also see the yellow, which is the Saginaw Treaty of 1819. And you see right on the northern part of the Saginaw Treaty boundary, that is basically Thunder Bay River. These are generalized lines here. They're by no means did you all of a sudden cross the river and all of a sudden you're in a different territory. It's just a general observation of how the treaties divvied up Michigan through its treaty systems. So let's talk about the Indigenous people that are up in this area, especially talking about contact periods. So we're talking about 1840s, 1830s. Prior to contact in that time period, we know that we believe that the Sioux tribes were up in this area and they occupied the Thunder Bay region, but eventually the Odawa, Ojibwe, and we're not sure if the Potawatomi were as active up here, but we definitely know the Odawa and the Ojibwe have heritage and connections to this region. We know that there's three known main campsites, villages, territories. Oops. If you're just calling in, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. And so we have three major known kind of settlement sites during contact period. You see probably like 6 of them on your screen right now. And the main ones are the Mishikiwis, Saganakato, and Shingobawasanosnikobawa. So you have, those are the main three. Please excuse my pronunciations. I'm by no means the expert on this. So if someone knows how to pronounce this a lot better than I do, please call me tomorrow and let me know. But the one that you see on North Point right there, there hasn't been much archaeological work in that area to the best of my knowledge, or primary sources in our records that show much of an interaction with any kind of campsites within that region. And so, let's break down really quickly kind of the main chiefs that were in this region upon contact. One of the main ones is Chief Shingobawasan. He was an Ojibwe chief, originally from the St. Mary's region. He dies around 1830, but before that, he really used Thunder Bay region as hunting grounds, migrating from the south side of the St. Mary's River and coming all the way as far south as this area to, such as hunting and gathering and such as that. He's important. He's a very well-respected Ojibwe chief. He's part of the 1820 Treaty of Sault Ste. Marie. He's part of the first Treaty of Prairie du Chien, and he's part of the 1826 Treaty of Fond du Lac. So he's a really important Ojibwe figure throughout the 1800s. And so when he kind of moved on, especially later on in his life, his followers eventually came farther and farther down and created a village or a small settlement site, and they incorporated his name on the south side of Alpena at the mouth of what was then known as Devil River. And this is what became Shingobawasan Gobawa, right? And so that translates over to place of image stones, or divine chief puts down more than one image stone. I won't go too much into the history of those words, but if you know anything about Othniik's history and its history with Indigenous people, you'll kind of understand a little bit more of the image stone. Bob Haltiner has a great book that does talk a little bit more in depth about the image stones. That name of that settlement might sound a little familiar, especially that middle part. Originally, it was called the Shingabawasan Kabawa, and then eventually David Oliver, when he settled there, who I'll get to in just a moment, he later went, well, let's just call it Wasanique, right? So of course, as is pretty common with any kind of language, when you're dealing with a situation native to English, the Anishinaabe language moving over to English, you're going to have mispronunciations, you're going to have misspellings. So eventually it goes from Wasanique with a W, and then it later becomes, as we know it now, Osanique with an O, right? So that's kind of a little bit of the origin towards that settlement site. You also have Chief Mashakiwis, not Mishakiwis, but Mashakiwis. He's born at Michilimackinac as a member of the Saginaw Band of the Chippewa, and he dies around 1803, 1806. And he was a very well-respected war chief as well, and he used Thunder Bay as hunting migrational grounds as well. So you have multiple groups using this region. He's important also because he's not just using this area, but his son, Mishakiwis, or what translates to English as Spirit of the West Wind, he later becomes the chief of the Thunder Bay Band of Indians, and he's well-respected down in that region. Upon the point of contact in the 1840s, we know that Mishakiwis was kind of in charge about roughly 25 or so, Indigenous people in this region. And by the time he dies in the 1840s, it's counted that he was probably close to about 100 years. So he had a very long life. And because of that life, we're talking, pre-1800s, Revolutionary War period. So because of his location and the tribes he was with, he was part of the British endeavors with the War of 1812. A lot of the native chiefs in these regions are attributed to being on the British side of armed conflict throughout Michigan early on. And Mishakiwis is a real key figure in keeping business people away from Alpena for as long as he was able to, because he definitely did not want anyone coming into the territory and settling there, because he knew what that would mean long term for his people and their ability to live their life. And then third but not least, of course, is Chief Saganakato. Again, I've never heard his name said out loud to me, at least within my job. So if I'm saying this wrong, please call me up or let me know in the chat. I'm doing my best to pronounce these ones. But he was born in the Thunder Bay region in 1776, and he dies later in 1869. But when he's born in this area. It's claimed that he was born on Oxbow along the river on the south banks. So pretty much it could be anywhere. Roughly, many people will point kind of towards the Alpena Fairgrounds and a little bit up into where Chisholm is. So that whole area could be kind of considered Oxbow. We also have to remember during this time there were no dams. The river and its estuaries were very different during that time. So there is no point to this section, and that's exactly where he was at, right? And so Saganakato's name translated directly to thundercloud, and he was an Odawa chief. He was not a Ojibwe, he was an Odawa, and he was in charge of the Ojibwe people that were underneath him. He was an under chief at the Battle of Thames, and he fought with the British at Mackinac as well. After white settlement of the region, he's one of the few people to have stayed post-contact in the area, and he actually eventually buys land at Partridge Point. After his death, his grave, he was buried in the cemetery in the area, and unfortunately after his death in 1869, his grave was desecrated by white settlers in the regions, and his burial gifts that were buried with him as part of his, his beliefs and customs. All right. I think there's someone's got me on a speaker, so I think there's a little feedback there, but I think we figured it out. And so, unfortunately, of course, like I was saying, his burial grounds were desecrated and his burial rights were stolen from his grave. So those are kind of the main chiefs and players in this region. I really just want to kind of set the stage for understanding kind of 1840s and on. So next slide. All right, so quickly to talk about names and such as well. We have Anamackee, different spelling of Anamackee and Alpena, right? So this is a great map that was is at the MSU's library. And this is, depicting Alpena before it became known as Alpena County, of course, and known as Anamackee. And so Alpena region originally was attached to Presqu'île and Sheboygan counties, and it was known by its larger name, which was the Thunder Bay region. And so it also was attached to Mackinac County originally for municipal and judicial purposes as an overall county region. Originally, we see this kind of region referred to as Anamackee, and it's believed that it's after an Ojibwe chief known as Anamackee, and it's said that he was involved in the signing of the Treaty of 1826 with Henry Schoolcraft. I think that this is the Treaty of Fond du Lac, but I can't really find any records that really pinpoint him being the signer. Maybe he signed for someone else. I'm not really sure. I haven't been able to find any other records, at least within ours or MSU's or Clark, that support this claim just yet. So, and this kind of referred to most of the area north of Ausable. By 1843, we eventually see the name was changed to Alpena by Schoolcraft. But again, as pretty similar with Anamickee, we see the correct name was supposed to be Alpena, A-W-P-E-N-A, and not A-L-P-E-N-A, but it's kind of how that story goes quite too often, unfortunately. And that original word means not quite a partridge, half a partridge. Some people will just say a partridge. But that's a little bit around the name of our region in terms of land. When we talk about the bay and its references to becoming Thunder Bay, right? I get this all the time. Why are we called Thunder Bay? What is it that distincts this location as a Thunder Bay? And so we can kind of look from a different accounts. The first time we ever get a white visitor in Thunder Bay was actually the Jesuit La Salle, and that might sound familiar because he was aboard the Griffin at the time, which is a relatively famous vessel if you're into maritime history in the Great Lakes. And in this account, we see accounts of a violent southwesterly wind that most of us, if we're from Alpena, are all too familiar with. And the southwesterly wind, oh, sorry, my screen was messing up with me, so I got to make sure. Oh, there we go. All right. So we all of a sudden get this record of La Salle and his crew being up in Thunder Bay region, and they're taking shelter from the strong winds that are coming across the coast of eastern Michigan. And they basically are worried that they're going to crash, that they're going to sink in this because the storms are so violent there. And it's actually the author of the records claims that this is probably the first time a Christian prayer was heard or said in this bay as well. And then, so back into the name of the bay itself. So originally the bay is Anse du Tonnerre, which translates to Bay of Thunder in French. And the first time we ever see that referenced is in 1688. We had a cartographer that was the royal cartographer for France, and it's Jean-Baptiste Louis Franklin, and he writes Anse du Tonnerre. And so there's a lot of different theories. We have this early account of, the Bay of Thunder or Thunder Bay being used, and there's a lot of different theories as to how did this happen? How did we come up with Bay of Thunder, right? And so there's different accounts. There's one account by George Harriet in 1807. He talks about a meteorological explanation, right? Like just that the Bay of Thunder, just so many thunderstorms, and it's just crazy how these just blow up out of nowhere, and that's how it's got its name. There's also the story of Wanoka, and this is a local native story. And this is, I won't go too much in the depth. There's a great write-up about it in Bob Haltiner's book that describes this more into detail. And then there's a third explanation, and this is by Fred B. Vogele, and he does a history and a research trip for the U.S. fisheries and creates a book. And he's just saying, it's Bay of Thunder, it's Anamackee, and that's how it comes. So it's just the bay of this region, so therefore it becomes Bay of Anamackee. So there's really no known, like, here's a singular, this is what it is. So, but there's a couple different theories out there. I've heard a bunch of other ones too, but these are the main three that do pop up when we talk about this place. So now that we kind of talked about the space and such, let's talk about Michigan, right? So we got to paint the picture for what's going on in Michigan to paint the picture of what's going on in Alpena, right? So on January 12th of 1835, we know that the territorial governor of Stevens T. Mason says, hey, we're ready to become a state. Michigan is ready to join the United States, and the Congress goes, not yet, right? So the Congress says, first you got to do some work before you can officially become a state. And so Stevens and his legislature combine and they go, okay, what do we need to do to address here? And by by October 5th of the same year, 1835, Michigan votes and accepts the Constitution presented to them, and they elect Stevens T. Mason as the first governor of Michigan. But Michigan is still not accepted as a state by the Congress. So before Michigan could become a state, Congress said, you got to stop fighting with Ohio. Both Ohio and Michigan were both laying claims to a small strip of land that is now known as Toledo. But Congress refused to allow Michigan to become a state. And they said, you got to figure this out with Ohio. We don't care which way you guys decide. We just want to know, figure it out, and then we'll let you become a state. It took up to about a year before what was known kind of locally as the Toledo War to be settled. And in the end, Toledo became part of Ohio, and Michigan was given western part of the Upper Peninsula instead. And so finally, by the January 26th of 1837, Michigan becomes a state. And after the territory becomes a state, a series of surveying began in the state to better understand the regions that made up this new place, right? You have to survey a region to understand where your railroads need to go. You can't sell land until you've had it surveyed. So from the 1830s, late 1830s to the 40s, we see this huge swath of surveying happen all over the state. There's several different surveyors that talk about constantly running into other survey teams, exchanging information. They said, so we have all these different teams scouring all the different parts of Michigan to help this newly formed state truly understand the extent of which their lands were. And so we see the Department of the United States surveyors began surveying public lands, and then the state handled the rest, right? So 1837, 1838, 39 surveys began all throughout the state. And then this is where we start getting the primary sources within our archive. So the spring of 1839, state of Michigan hired Lewis Klassen and Thomas Patterson of Cincinnati, Ohio, and they wanted them to survey subdivisions of Township 27, 28, 29, and 30 North, and then from Range 4 to Lake Huron. So that covers basically almost all of Northeast Michigan from Osable up, right? And part of that team is David D. Oliver. He's hired by Klassen to become a chain carrier in his team. And from there, of that spring of 1839, this team, newly hired and sent up, they make it all the way up to Bay City, which at this time is a very, very small little outpost just south of the Osable River for them. And so from there, they travel to the Osable River once the ice breaks and sail from the Osable up to Devil River, where they begin their first survey that we ever know of the actual land of what now comprises our region. You can see on this slide right here, David D. Oliver on the left, and this is actually the original survey that Klassen's team does with David D. Oliver back in 1839. And so you can see Thunder Bay River there. You can see the bay itself. You can see Mud Lake right there and different parts. So there's a whole different series. And then this was very kindly given to us by the Archives of Michigan. They were really helpful with finding some of this original documentation. So this is a great look in the scene, how the survey was going at that time. So we know that the first survey of Alpena was in the spring of 1839. And when they report back to the government, and they go, hey, we just did our survey. We took an inventory of what the land's like. They go, this land's worthless. It's all cedar swamp. You can't really do much with this area. Sorry to tell you, but there's nothing really you can ever be able to do up here. We know now that that's not the case later on, and so we'll get that in just a moment. So after that report, they are sent back up to cover more of northern Alpena, what we now know as Alpena County, up to Presqu'île, right? So they covered half of Alpena County, what we now know as Alpena County, and all of the Presqu'île area, and most of Sheboygan as well. And Oliver does join this team as well. So a lot of this information you'll hear from today are from Oliver's publications, and which is great to have because he's one of the first settlers in the region as well as being one of the first surveyors of the region. So we have a great history that kind of combines underneath him. Within his surveying notes and his centennial history book, he talks about his first interaction with the local natives, and mainly Mishikiwas. And he comes into contact with their band in 1840, And the natives in that region come out to not so much greet the surveyors, but go, "Why are you here? What is going on?" Oliver seems to have known some of the language, and goes, "Hey, you know, we're not staying. This land's worth us. We're just sent up here to survey. Don't worry, we're not staying. We'll be on our way." After some more conversation, it seems that Mishikiwis kind of understood Oliver as being in charge, and so kind of did something that was very uncharacteristic for Mishikiwis, which was he actually invited Oliver into his wigwam and showed him his prized possessions. And these were a broadcloth blanket, otter skin tobacco bag, a peace pipe, and other beading clothing. And then there's clearly within Mishikiwis's personal collection materials that came from the British government, trophies or rewards for his loyalty to the British forces, probably during 1812 and before. After this interaction, Oliver and his team borrow the canoe given to them by Mishikiwis's group, and they sail across the river to finish their work up and going up towards the north parts of Presqu'île, whereupon most of the team leave. David D. Oliver actually stays in 1840 and spends the next year or so hunting and trapping out the region, but not so much settling. And then, so before jumping to the next slide and talk about about Alpena's growth, I really want to quickly mention the Swampland Act of 1850. And in 1850, Congress passed an act that would change how swamplands can be sold, which spurs on the acquisition of lands in Alpena and others. If it gets them to mute. And so this law comes into effect in 1850, and it essentially provides a mechanism for reverting the title of federally owned swampland to states which would agree to drain the land and turn it into productive agricultural use. So really, once this happens, you start to see more and more interest by lumber industries to look towards this area, because now they can effectively utilize the majority of the swamplands and the cedar swamplands in this region for lumbering purposes. So we start talking about American settlement in this area, or white settlement. We know 1835, we have people such as W.F. Collings, who's arriving in Thunder Bay Island and residing, and he eventually resides in the county for the rest of his life. But these people are coming to Thunder Bay Island. It's a lot quicker to come to Thunder Bay Island. You can still see all the ships passing. It's not as dangerous as being in Alpena itself, or in what's now known as Anamickee. So you see a lot of fisher people staying out in Thunder Bay Island, using that as the seasonal homes, and sailing in to do their fishing and being able to pass it along to vessels as they pass the island itself. They just had to signal them with the lighthouse and flags, and they'd be able to bring a schooner in closer, and they could trade off from there. Later, by the fall of 1844, we hear of what's known as the J House. Of course, we don't have any images or drawings of it. The J House being built on the corner of River and First Streets. And the J House was mainly, house is a bit of a nice term. It's basically a shanty or a shack that was just built mainly for hunters and trappers and fishers to use it seasonally. And so we know that the first party that came in that used this were 4 French hunters and trappers, a French and Indigenous heritage and they came down from Mackinac to Thunder Bay, and they lived the house only for seasonal use. We know in 1851, Walter Scott comes into Thunder Bay River. He's a bit of an interesting character himself, and he basically moves there primarily for fishing and trade with the Thunder Bay Band of Indians in this region. He eventually moves away in 1857, says it starts to become too crowded with all these white people. He sold whiskey. Alpena has a very long history of being a temperance town, and so he and the founders and I guess higher ups of Alpena did not blend very well. And so I think after some hurt feelings and some incidents, Walter Scott said, "I'm done with this. I'm going to move back north and get into some more quiet regions." And of course, we can't talk about settlement of Alpena in the 1850s without talking about the Carter family, right? So Sarah Carter, you can see on the left side of the screen, Daniel Carter on the right, and together they built a home in the 1860s, and that is known as the Carter House. Fortunately, it's no longer here. It's basically kind of right where the shopping center is downtown, just off where Chisholm and State and First kind of meet. So really the first non-native family of settlers was Daniel and Sarah Carter and their daughter Mary. And this kind of attributed to them because they're really the first ones to move there, and not just for seasonal housing. They are there for the long haul, and they are settling there. They even have their own little garden in the backyard. And so before they moved up there in 1853, George Fletcher sends Oliver up to Alpena and goes, I want you to find me the proper pinelands. I want you to figure out what land should I be buying? What am I getting myself into? So Oliver comes up here, reports back, tells him where to buy some of his land. And then after that, 1853, he comes back up in November of 56, and he brings his wife, Sarah and Mary, with him. And so that's when they really start to become the first settlers, is in that 1856 period. For a long period of time, once the Carter House was built in 1860, their house acted very much as the hotel, right? There is no Holiday Inn, there's no hotel or any residential homes except for the Carters before this. So either you stayed at the Carter's house if you're lucky, or you were staying outside, potentially in some type of tent or some type of shanty, which was not ideal back then, especially in some of the harsher weather. Sarah herself and their daughter Mary are both very fascinating people. Sarah Carter acted as the nurse, as the physician, as a surgeon, until about 1866 when Dr. William Maiden came in. So Sarah had a lot of importance in the community, bringing the community, keeping people healthy, and being a semi-surgeon until they could be loaded on a boat off of Thunder Bay Island and then sent down to, what would have been then Detroit or such to get proper medical care. Daniel Carter himself was a major character, not just because of his influence on the lumber industry, but he was also pivotal in legislative operations for the Alpena County and the city itself. And then he also was pivotal in helping build in 1882 10 miles of state road that led into Montmorency. Mary Carter herself is also important because she becomes the very first teacher for the first school in Alpena. And she has, unfortunately, a very short life, but she's definitely remembered throughout many of the archives that we access. We continue to talk about late 1850s. We know that we get the Panic of 1857, and this caused great hardship for the finances of the county or the country itself, and almost brought Alpena's growth as a lumber settlement to an end. George N. Fletcher was not affected as greatly by the hardships, and he had made recent smart financial options prior to the panic that led to him having the finances necessary to contribute more to Alpena's growth so that the town itself did not fail. We know that around this time, J.K. Miller or Joseph Kingsbury Miller and Addison F. Fletcher come in 1857, and they're sent by George N. Fletcher for the purposes of building a store and a boarding house around September or August of 1857. J.K. Miller is an interesting person as well because he's actually the father-in-law of George N. Fletcher, and he is actually a huge component of bringing Bible studies and Christianity to this region, and is pretty pivotal with a lot of the church formations in this region as well. Addison Fletcher, he's the first town clerk of the region. He's very pivotal in helping operations of the township and the county in its early history. He's also, I believe, the first, he would have been the first supervisor or director of the school upon its creation in the 60s or 1860s. By the fall of 1857, Fletcher and his partners start the first store in Fremont, now known as we know as Alpena. And this store was known as the Miller after Joseph Kingsbury Miller, and Fletcher after himself and company, other smaller vestures in that. You can see in this image, actually in the top right, that what looks like a two-story building with the two windows that make up the third, that would have been Fletcher, Miller and Company. And that's a very important building in the early history, especially 1850s and 60s in this region. That store originally is just used to sell, general goods for the small working population in the area, whiskey, tobacco, although Miller was not a big fan of the whiskey or tobacco. He sold it anyways because it did sell. Later, that region becomes the Myers block after Julius Myers, and he operated a clothing business and was the president of the Hebrew Benevolent Society around 1878. Recently, we know as a community that this area was leveled out for future development purposes, but that would have been right where that building is right where I believe Water and I'm not from here originally, so sometimes I get my streets mixed up, but Water and 2nd Avenue right on that corner. The main vessel that's transporting people and supplies up to this region during that time is the JS Minor. And around 1858, we really start to see more and more investments into the Alpena region, and we start to see more families starting to come up and more working people coming up here as well. Such people are Edward K. Potter, and he's attributed with the business that was the first company to scale and mark the first log in Alpena city limits. Abram Hopper, he came to Alpena with Moses Bingham, and they were both millers by trade and heavily involved. Hopper was heavily involved as a township clerk and bookkeeper for a variety of businesses. We had W. Stevenson. Moses Bingham is a very important person because he erects the first hotel, which is known as the Bingham Hotel, and also Thomas Murray. So in 1859, we get accounts of Alpena almost falling into ruin again. It's very touch and go for a long time for Alpena's history, right? So in 1859, we see provisions start to run dangerously low. And so both the village and the lumber camps itself survived only just off of whitefish and bread, very stale bread, from February to March. We have to remember the majority of provisions that were coming into this region to support the people there were coming on the JS Minor. And so if that vessel did not bring enough provisions in the previous season, it's going to be a really rough winter for you. And so you want to be really careful. And there's a couple letters that are notated in primary sources that talk about how hard those couple months really were for them and how pretty scarce food was for a while. Of course, JS Minor does come to the rescue later that spring. It comes with supplies and more people. And this issue of supply and demand doesn't really get solved until in the 1860s when you see more investors contributing, but it really doesn't get solved until the late 1860s, 1870s when we start to see agricultural uses of the region starting to grow and become more and more successful. We see that the first steam sawmill in Alpena County is built for Fletcher and Lockwood Minor and was completed in the same year, 1859. And this is really important for lumber history in Alpena because now that you have the mill, you can now export the wood out of Alpena. You can now send it to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Chicago, to Canada. And so you can start bringing money back in rather than just pumping money constantly. So this is when we really start to see a shift, economically speaking, and in terms of the lumber industry for Alpena. From then on, the areas the lumber machine was directly connected to the needs of the cities all throughout the Great Lakes. And Alpena played a great part in helping Chicago recover after its famous fire known as the Great Fire of 1871. So becoming a county, right? So let's talk a little bit about the formation of the county and the formation of the township. So in 1853, we know that Sheboygan County was organized, and Montmorency, Presqu'île, Alpena, and Oscoda and Arcona are all attached to Sheboygan for judicial and municipal purposes. By the spring of 1855, we get the first tax assessment of Alpena as a region. And by 1856, we see the first tax collection happen. And we get about $500 in the records that go right up to Sheboygan for the uses on tax. By the fall of 1856, Daniel Carter obtained the necessary signatures to petition for the organization of Alpena County, separate from Sheboygan. And by February 1857, state legislature passes an act that organizes the county of Alpena, and thus we see the creation of the Board of Supervisors, with its members being Daniel Carter of Fremont, Harvey Harwood of Thunder Bay Island, and David D. Oliver of Devil River. This really took a lot of gumption, and there's a couple of primary sources that talk about this fact. They're applying to become a county, and there really isn't too many people there. It's a very small population, maybe about 200, 300 people, and mostly wilderness. There's no roads that lead up there. There's not a very reliant supply system during this time too. And also it's noted that there's only one freeholder at the time in Alpena County, right? So if those attending are not familiar with what a freeholder is one who holds title in real property in fee simple, and they have to be a resident within this district. So if we really do a quick history and voting rights, the right to vote started in 1876 for white men who own land. So that would have applied to this period of time. And we don't see this change until 1868 when we see the 14th Amendment come in. And then later in 1870 when we see the 15th Amendment gets rid of racial barriers to vote. So we really start to see the ability to vote and delegate itself grow as voting laws change over the next 20 or so years. Also, another part of becoming a county that was a bit scary for some was that the integration in becoming a county also came at considerable cost to the property owners in that region. And so once they kind of get organized, because they only had one freeholder, the state actually assigns those three gentlemen that I mentioned earlier to become part of the board of supervisors. And so given all this limitations of experience and access to financing and office space, the board really did its best to coordinate the powers of the county, but it was not without its struggles in the early days, mainly in dealing with tax collections going to Sheboygan. Even though they had been organized, some of the tax money was still going to Sheboygan. And it was really hard at the time, right? You can't pick up a phone, you can't just send a letter and put the postage on it and it goes, right? So you would either have to go directly to Sheboygan, which would either be a horse ride or a wagon ride, or you sail up most likely. You'd sail up to Sheboygan headquarters and you would talk to them. That came at cost. Or worst case scenario, you'd have to go all the way back down to Lansing and go to the house and talk to them. Again, came at great considerable cost. So it was by no means an easy fix. You couldn't pick up your phone, send an email, or even send a letter. And depending on the weather, it was pretty spotty. And so you really see them kind of do their best to formalize Alpena as a county. So with that comes kind of the village of Fremont. They're both very much tied into each other. We see in October of 1856, Fletcher Oldfield Miner hire E.A. Breckenridge, and his purpose is to make the first survey of the village itself, which has then become Fremont, and to establish 2 squares for the county purposes. So back in 1856, when they're starting to go, hey, we need to get the survey, we need to get this running, they know they're going to try to appeal to make the county. The first flag that's raised over the village of Alpena is the flag of Fremont, which you can see on the bottom right. That's most likely the very type of flag that would have flown over Alpena for the first time. And the Fremont was a presidential candidate during that period of time. He's a bit of an interesting character. I highly recommend you looking him up. I won't go too much into his history here, but mainly he was a very pivotal American explorer, military officer during the Civil War. He was also a U.S. Senator for California. He was the Republican nominee for the president in 1856. And he was from Georgia, but he was an opponent of slavery at the time. So he has a bit of a complicated past and a complicated ending to his life. He dies absolutely destitute in New York City in 1890. So becoming Fremont, we see February 7th, 1857, the state legislature approved the organization of Alpena County with Fremont as the county seat on 2 squares. So those 2 squares are 8th and 9th and Lockwood and River. They're still the county squares. So that's where the courthouse building and the adjacent building, the annex building as well. So that's still part of that original 1857, 1856 survey. I always find that interesting because that's how you shape your history, and it makes sense that it's still there. And so the first act of the county board was to establish Fremont as a formal township. And then after that passing of that in February, the second meeting, we see the highway commissioners at this time took place and established a road and vote to establish a road from the mouth of Thunder Bay to Devil River, now Anamickee. By February 29th, 1859, we do see Fremont's name officially changed to Alpena by the request of the citizens. And it's assumed that basically just because Fremont did not win, his history got a little spotty after a little while there. So I think the fervor kind of wore off and they decided to go back with maybe a more traditional name. So let's talk about the thriving 1860s for Alpena. By 1860, the village of Alpena was directly shaped by its lumber industry pursuits. Many of the people coming to Alpena had some connection to the growing lumber industry, exporting out of the river. Majority of people were lumberjacks, there for seasonal contracts, living out of the lumber camps near town. Many of the lumberjacks coming to Alpena for lumber were coming from the East Coast and were comprised of Irish, Scottish, English, Norwegian, Polish, German, and Canadian ancestry, and that's just to name a few. So it's a pretty diverse group of people coming into this region to make their impact and their money. Many of these ethnic groups that created the early lumbermen and therefore the families in this region later grew up in this region and contributed to the community, created social clubs like the German Hall, the Polish Hall. They also created bands. There was the German band, there was the Norwegian band, and they also created very importantly, that still lasts with us, churches, right? So a lot of people go, oh, that's the Irish church, that's the French church, that's the Polish church, that's the Norwegian church. So that's really a big part of Alpena's diverse ethnic makeup that it happens in the 1860s. A big part of that, as I previously mentioned, was that island mill owned by Lockwood and Miner. That was the one that being built in 1859. And so we start to see the lumber coming out of Alpena and money coming back into Alpena for improvements. And by the year 1864, we really see a turning point occur in this area. David D. Oliver calls this point, this transition from general scarcity to a time of general plenty. And at this time, there was the Oldfield and Fletcher Mills, Box Hotel, 2 boarding houses, and a couple shabby buildings known as the Salt Block on the north side, and several private dwellings on the north side as well. And on the south side, there was the Lockwood and Miner, Island, and Lester Mills. For the 1864s, we see this substantial growth. We see more mills being made, and a large part of this is because of the economy of the Civil War really spurred on a lot of lumber development in Alpena itself. We also see in 1864, Thunder Bay Dam Company builds their own dam and completes it on the east side of the river by John Oldfield. The completion of the dam and its connected mill provides over 40 jobs. During the 60s as well, in 1865, the First Congregational Society commenced the erection of a church on the north side of 2nd Avenue, still the location of its church location. We also see in the same year, Union Star Hotel and the Alpena House are built, or bleeding over into the 1866, and many more mills begin dotting up around the river itself. And by 1868, we see endeavors to build or to drill for salt, hoping they can build a salt quarry, but instead find mineral water. And this was done by Addison Fletcher and Lockwood. And this actually later becomes the site of the Fletcher House that is later constructed in 1872, which is now the site of the current library. And just for reflection, in 1864, the population of Alpena Township was 674. By 1870, the population was 2,756. So we really see a population boom here in this region. We started to see more agricultural pursuits happening in the 1860s. George Fletcher rented out some land in the hopes that of it becoming for agricultural use. We also see a man known as Antoine or Antoine. I've seen it both ways. And they all start farming the soil in Alpena County. Originally, they're kind of disputed as being kind of crazy. There's no way you're going to be able to grow in a cedar bog, but some of them are successful. And you start seeing potatoes and begas and other such hardier, more starch-forward crops coming in to the economy in that area, helping out with nutritional value as well. By 1867, Alpena was a thriving village with a robust economy, and prominent figures of the region began necessary improvements to the infrastructure. A main part of that improvement was its harbors, its roads, its docks, its warehouses, and small business places, right? Not just a mill, not just some large building, but you could have multiple businesses in one building or one block. A main exploit was that in the winter of 1867 and 68, the Harbor Improvement Company was organized by the township for the purposes of dredging out the river further towards its mouth and extending out the docks and the harbors until it's about 12 feet. If you ever come into our office, you'll actually see some maps from early 1900s, and you can actually see how far out those harbor pierways were. And in parts of those harbors now form what we now use as the marina. We also see during this time, the only road during this time is the Osalo River. So it's literally just the river. And if it freezes over, great, you can get across it. If it doesn't freeze over and the weather's not good, you're probably going to be sailing down. And so you only see, dog teams or sled teams using in times of great frost to get across, to get downstate, or to get up in the Alpena region. So during this time, the state legislature goes, okay, we need to build a bridge over the Osalo River to give access to the Northern Territory parts. We also see, in terms of the downtown, specifically along the riverway, we start to see a great amount of construction happening along in terms of the first bridge. So we see the spring election of 1864, votes are accepted for about $1,000 to be collected on taxes and for a bridge to be built. And the first contractor is Obed Smith, and he builds this by 1869. It's not a great bridge. Later on, by 1872, it's already become degraded, and they use a floating scour, like a barge, to get people across from north side to south side. And it's not really solved until 1872 when a more robust bridge is built by Samuel Bogg. We also see during this time the second township, towards the late 1860s, the second township is organized in the county, and this is Anamickee in 1867. Harrisville has already been organized, but very quickly became the seat of Alpena, so it was no longer part of the Alpena County jurisdiction. We also see towns such as Corals come into existence, but very quickly evaporate into ghost towns because they just can't handle being on their own township and become reassimilated into the Alpena Township fold. By this time, we see the Board of Supervisors for the County of Alpena is comprised of Daniel Carter of Alpena, David D. Oliver of Anamickee, and Obed Smith of Alpena, and L.R. Dorr of Harrisville. And this is prior to Harrisville, of course, switching over to Alcona. Once Anamickee and these regions became townships, we do lose Daniel Carter and David D. Oliver as county members of the Board of Supervisors. By this time, they've been on the board for 10+ years. So let's talk real fast about the Civil War and Alpena's contribution. The Civil War, like I said earlier, is really key and pivotal to the growth of Alpena in terms of its economic pursuits. There are some people that come directly from Alpena that do participate in the Civil War, but like Moses Bingham and such. But many of them, after the Civil War, move up to Alpena itself. And so, for example, you can see on the screen on the top right, James J. Potter. He was part of the the 22nd Michigan Infantry Division, or the regiment. You also have Moses Bingham, who's, you can see with the purple arrow on there. That's actually accessible through Ancestry, which the library does provide to our patrons. And so you can actually look up these Civil War records. But that shows Moses Bingham as being part of the war effort on the Union side, and he's later discharged. I believe in 1862, he received a disabling shot when he was fighting, and therefore he's discharged honorably and sent back home to live out his days. Again, as a reminder, Moses Bingham is the hotel keeper of Bingham House. And a big part of the reason why the Civil War was important for Alpena is that as General Grant and Sherman are advancing deeper in the South, demand on Norway pine increases for the Union. And so the Norway pine is used for construction. It's used, its turpentine and tar is used for shipbuilding. And so Alpena really becomes a major player in that economy and sending the wood and materials down into that region. We see the greenbacks start showing up in Alpena by 1864, 2 years after they're first issued in 1862. Several businesses come to Alpena solely to kind of profit off the Civil War, mainly steam sawmills that handle increased demands in the lumber trade. And then we also see the increase of factories that do the turpentine and tar. And so Alpena continues to really boom under this increased need for Norway pine and the Union war effort. But once the Civil War ends, we start to see, especially the tar and turpentine business, cease to exist pretty much within a year or two after the Civil War ends. So it's just, again, a quick history into the Civil War itself. Like I said, it's a general history glossing over. I'm already going pretty long as I'm speaking. Each one of these slides really could be a book on itself. So I always encourage people to reach out to me if you want to learn more, or if you want to take this in your own hands and do some research yourself. So let's talk about early schools. Prior to the incorporation of the city of Alpena, we see that the first school opened in 1858, and it's actually operated in an abandoned copper shop on the riverbank and had about 9 pupils at the time. Classes were only held in late winter or summer months sometimes. And the first teacher, as I mentioned slightly earlier, was Mary Lavina Carter, and she was 18 years old at the time. By 1859, a better building was found for education, and this is actually the Miller Building, or the Miller, Fletcher and Company building. That building, again, like I said, is very pivotal to some of the early history in this region because it was one of the few public gathering areas you can go to. And so part of the upper floors were given for the classes. Around the same time, Addison Fletcher was elected the first school director for the school district itself. During the years at Miller Building, students came from both sides of the river, and those on the north side actually had to ferry over since the bridge had not been built by that time. And so there's accounts of the children being envious on the south side, watching their peers have the fun of crossing the river on a rowboat right before running up to school. In 1863, we see the actual first school built by the district. This was a frame building built by Samuel Boggs, and this is the building that's actually depicted on the slide in front of you. It's described as being out in the bush near a frog pond or in a frog pond, depending on who you talk to, and with a little plank leading up to it. This is, at the time that it was mentioned in Ella White's history book on education in Alpena, she talks about it originally being, oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The building I just described is actually not the Union School. This is the first building built. The next school being built is the Union School. So the school that I just talked about, sorry. Oh, Cooper, thank you, Kathy. And so we see that this first school building is not the Union Hat School. That's my fault. But the first school is built pretty shabby. It's nothing too fantastic. And this is on West Chisholm, 400 West Chisholm. It's reported to have been kind of roughly where the old Restore building was before it burned down, according to Polk directories. We see later by 1869, J.K. Lockwood comes in and actually purchases this land from underneath the school. There's some issues with title. So then the school district had to go, okay, where do we need to go next? And so they start looking at what will then become the Union School, which is what's on the slide. So 1868, construction begins on the Union School, and it wasn't completed until about 1870. Leading up to it, the school board voted to build the school system. Samantha E. Hitchcock was grateful enough to have donated 6 lots for the purpose of erecting a schoolhouse, and plans for the school were displayed at the courthouse and officially adopted later on. The new Union School was finished around 1870s or so, and was 3 stories with a cupola on the top. This building itself was constructed of pine, a foundation of stone from Alpena's quarries, and white pine shingles for the roof. The style of the building was modeled after the Romanesque style, which is apparent in its arch windows. And originally, the first paint color for it was white. We also see some private schools dotting up here, but these aren't really until the 1880s. Cass School, Lockwood, Baldwin, these are all 1885, 1882, and 1884, respectively. So it's just a quick note about the schools itself. An even quicker note about the religious centers here. We know that the first known meeting took place in around 1857 when the Carter family hosted a Bible study in their home. Joseph Miller was supposedly part of the original class as a teacher. And then we see by 1862 later on, we see the establishment of the Congregational Church formally. And Deacon Hitchcock at the time, who had built the Deacon's Courthouse, which is currently was located where the Centennial Building is now, they used this location after the Miller and Fletcher store around 1865. By 1865, later in the year, George Fletcher donates the lot on the corner of 2nd and Lockwood. And by 1868, Congregation builds the new church. And by 1866, we see with the growing population and more people coming in here, we see a greater diversification of Christian groups. The Congregational Church is a pretty ubiquitous, non-quote-unquote denominational based church. Kind of anybody can join, and reflected very much the early history of Alpena. But as you get more people from different ethnic backgrounds and religious makeups, they start to build their own places of worship as well. And so when we look at some of the original congregations, this is by no means a representation of all of them, but just kind of some of the main ones. Prior to the 1880s, we see the Methodist organized in 1867. We see Grace Lutheran, which is sometimes referred to as the Norwegian Church, and that's established in 1873. And its first church building is built in its current location. We see the German Baptist, but this is after 1880. We see the Presbyterians, which are just slightly about 1884. And we see St. Paul, 1871, with the arrival of Reverend H. Buckner in Alpena, and he comes forward and helps establish this church. Trinity Episcopal is another famous one. Its parish is organized in 1867. And then we also have the Temple Bethel, And you unfortunately don't see a lot of mentioning of it in any of the history books or much in the newspaper as well. But we do know that Julius Myers was one of the early Jewish residents of Alpena, and he comes in around 1867 following the Civil War because he was a participant in that on the Union side. And by 1887, we know that there's about roughly 45 Jewish adults who had settled in the area. But around 1875, we do know that the Hebrew Benevolent Society bought and founded the Alpena's Jewish Cemetery, which is still in its current location. You can see it on the Evergreen side of Washington Avenue. We know that the early Jewish congregation operated out of Julius Myers' house, and then eventually rented a building in the rented a space within the Whitney block on 2nd Ave. And then it wasn't until about 1891 when Temple Bethel found its current location that you can see on White Street. So that's, again, quick history. I just want to give some quick first and looks into that, the religious and education history. So let's talk about the troubling 1870s, or what David D. Oliver really talks about the troubling 1870s. So on the 20th of May of 1870, the Board of Supervisors for the Alpena County was called together to organize Rogers City as a township in the Presqu'île area. By this time, Alpena had become a major leader of all towns in the county, basically a political powerhouse for the region. And previously to this meeting in 1869, the county had seen both Harrisville go into Alcona, and then together with these regions come into the county of Escoda when Alpena County became organized. This left Alpena County with only 2 organized towns at this time, which was Anamickee and Alpena. So a petition was organized in Rogers City into a township and was accepted. And the big proponent that was Albert Molitor. And so he was selected as a representative for Rogers City at the time. This started what David D. Oliver writes as a time of trial for the township of Alpena. I don't know if David D. Oliver is eccentric or just telling it how he saw it, but he really calls Albert Molitor, Chase W. Richardson of Alpena, and George W. Robinson of Anamickee, who comprised the board of the county board. And he basically calls them the hawks who preyed upon Alpena during this time. He draws a lot of analogies between Alpena being the partridge, kind of playing off its original origins of name, and calling this county board as being the hawks who were out to destroy the township of Alpena. So these 3 gentlemen began a series of what Oliver calls as aggressions that seems to be also reflected by the people within the major parts of the township. And it's really seen, these aggressions are seen as an attempt to uproot Alpena's political and economic powers in its time. These aggressions are mentioned, as Oliver calls them, illegal large salaries for different positions such as the sheriff, county treasurer, county clerk, and prosecuting attorney in 1871. And so you start seeing these grumblings, but 1871 is when you really start to see the fire lit by the people that live in the township for going, what do we need to do to protect ourselves? We also see in 1871 large parts of the township being broken off and assigned to Rogers and Anamickee as well. So the people of Alpena start to see their territories kind of being petitioned off, and they're not very happy about it. So the people of Alpena Township become alarmed by these situations, and they hold several meetings from 1868, 1869, all the way up to 1871, culminating in the February of 1871 at the Evergreen Hall, which was on the north side, where they took matters into creating a committee to seek the establishment of the township of Alpena into a city corporation. William Jenney Esquire was called to the chair, and PM Johnson was made secretary. A committee was appointed by these 2 gentlemen to draft up a charter. And these key people were Seth L. Carpenter, who you see on the left screen, Jay Stevenson, Jason Chase, Jason Cass, A.W. Comstock, D. McRae, J.D. Holmes, and A. Hopper. This committee stated that the deficiencies, and I quote, the deficiencies of the present township government were the cause which led to these proceedings. And then after a petition of 300 names was signed and sent to legislators for the city corporation to seek this change. There were some who did oppose it that had signed it originally, and we do know that there was a remonstrance, or what you can basically translate over to an anti-charter request was sent, but there was only about 6 or so people. So not long after these 300 names sent over the request to accept the charter, state legislature awards the charter to the city of Alpena. And through the act of legislature number 249, it's approved in March 29th, 1871. And so they go, okay, great, you're an incorporated city. Now here's the terms that kind of define you. The city was divided into what was then 3 wards. The first and the second comprised the land on the south side of the river, and the third, all that lay north of the river. What you see as outlined is really a rough estimate. This is a 1925 map. We have a earlier map, but it's framed, and I was not courageous enough to take it off the wall and try to photograph it for the purposes. So don't quote me, but that's basically kind of rough-balled what the wards would have comprised during that time. And so from that division, you know how your voting party. The wards at that time were kind of like your city council as we see it today. So Seth L. Carpenter, part of the original committee, he becomes the first mayor when he's voted in April 1871. He's a bit of a unique person because he moves into Alpena much like everyone else in 1868. He's a bookkeeper for the firm L.M. Mason and Co. And by 1870, he's also elected county clerk. So he has experience working for the county and such, and so people really see him as an advantageous person to help lead the city in its early infancy. You know, we see on the establishment of the 3 wards, the first ward is headed by Alexander McDonald. The second ward, James J. Potter, who had participated in the Civil War, as I mentioned earlier, and James McTavish for the third ward. We then see 6 wards being established, and I believe this was between 1891, 1893. If anyone knows the exact time, I have a couple different legislative acts, but none of them actually pinpoint the exact time because I don't have access to the original. So if anyone does actually know the exact date of when this shift happens from 3 wards to 6, that would be great to add into this this situation. That'd be great to help me out. And so we see a different series of different political positions for the city start to be elected in, and we start to see the foundation of the city happen. The incorporation of the city of Alpena had many frightened, much like the incorporation or the organization of the county in the early years in the 1850s. You know, going from a township to a true city is a change. There would be an increase in taxes. Some thought this would cause financial ruin and the eventual failure of the city itself. But as we all know, the city has survived since. Even though large sections of the township, even though we get the incorporation of the city, portions of the city that were not incorporated remain part of the township, and large enough sections of those parts allow for the township to survive. And we see N. Breckenridge elected as the first supervisor of Alpena following that time period. By May 8, 1871, the board supervisor meeting for the county after the incorporation of the city saw both Robinson and Molitor absent. Molitor was later shot and killed in his hometown. There's a great book out there that I highly recommend. We do have a copy of it, and I believe it is for sale at the Besser Museum. I might be misquoting that, but I believe it is. And it's a great book that talks about Molitor and its unique history and reception by the people that he worked with. And by 1873 in May, the board supervisors kind of correct this defeat, and they erect 2 townships known as Long Rapids and Wilson. So that's the incorporation of the town itself. And just to kind of wrap it up, we have the first few fires, and I kind of want to leave this for last because we do jump a little bit of time here, and so I wanted to kind of show the effect fires had on the township and also later on the city. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of it a little bit here. The next one's going to be fires, but this one's the first few cities. I get a small view of the slides, so sometimes I jump a bit. But so we get the incorporation of the city of 1871. You know, prior to 1872, jumping forward a little bit, all the financing that happens in Alpena happens in Detroit. And you can imagine the cost of doing that, the lack of communication, the delayed communication that happens because of that. So in 1872, we see Charles Beswick, Andrew Comstock, and William B. Comstock organize the Alpena Banking Company. And then by April 1872, Malt and J.L. Whiting organized the Exchange Bank, which you can actually see on the bottom right on your screen. 1872, we see the formation of the Fletcher House, that was erected by George and Fletcher as a result of finding the sulfur mineral water. And by July of 1873, Daniel Carter donated to the city of Alpena 10 acres of land for use as a cemetery, which is now where our cemetery is. The first white person to be buried there is Peter Douglas, and the first native is Panashewanako, and he is the son of Saganakato. And then, so we see the first formations of that. And just lastly, just a quick note about the first few years. By 1874, we also see the first lighthouse on the mouth of Thunder Bay River, what we call now as Sputnik or Little Red, and that was a $20,000 tax incentive to build this. So just wanted to give a bit of a glance of some major improvements. By no means is this the inclusive of all of them, but you know, just a quick glance of the successes of the city after its incorporation. So now we jump into the fires, and these are my last 2 or 3 slides here. We have a lot of fires. There are a lot of fires that affect many different buildings and have profound impacts in many different ways. These are kind of the 4 that stand out to me, and so I wanted to share these with you all. We have, you know, the July 1862 fire, and this is a fire that ran through the woods around Alpena, mainly destroying the standing timber and some of the large mills belonging to Lockwood and Miner. It doesn't affect so much the town itself at this time, but definitely affects the surrounding area. It also clear cuts portions of the region that helps with future growth and development for Alpena as well. There's accounts of people sailing into Thunder Bay only to see Alpena and seeing the burnt husk remains of the lumber industry surrounding for about, you know, a couple hundred feet and several thousand acres surrounding it. We also have the December 12th, 1870 fire, and this destroys the courthouse owned by Deacon Hitchcock. This building had been previously used for social purposes by Trinity Episcopal and other religious entities. And we also see this building used as a courthouse. When it was being used as a courthouse, there was a stove that caught fire in the judge probate office that was cooking oysters for a society event. And the county clerk's office was also located in the building as well. So when this building did burn, many people were trying to get as many of the county and judicial records out of the building. They succeed to a large part, but there are materials that are burnt. So sometimes we have gaps in our collections because they literally don't exist anymore to our knowledge because they were burnt out with the buildings with it. We have the 1871 fire. This is a very pivotal fire for Alpena's history as well. April 9th, 12 a.m., the alarm was raised. The first fire began in the saloon Guild and Cluey in the BB block. And this is situated between the Huron House and Bolton McRae store on the north side of the river. All the buildings, basically all the buildings caught fire, and without a fire engine or standing fire department, this decision was made to let these buildings burn down to the ground, but try to save some of the goods and furniture. Rarely worked because the fire would jump to the furniture goods and then eventually jump to the building next door. This fire jumped several streets on the north side and burned down the Star Hotel and other buildings nearby. Some of the main buildings burned down were the Huron House, Star Hotel, and Dock Street, now known as North 2nd Ave, Evergreen Hall, Bolton McRae stores, that was located on the corner of Fletcher and 2nd, which is now the Alpena Furniture Store. And I provided this image just to kind of give you a reference. So all that you're seeing on your screen right now would have been burned away. The Evergreen Hall is in the middle of this frame as well. So that whole region would have burned out in 1870. So we lost all those buildings. So basically the fire was from the river all the way to Fletcher Street and a little bit beyond. Following the fire, about 100 citizens were homeless. And really why this fire is important, not just its effects on the landscape, but this fire really showed that the city needed to organize a fire department, a fire company. So by May 30th, 1871, the city comes together and goes, we need to make a fire department, and they create the Saganakato after the Thunder Bay band of Indian chief, and they create a fire company after his name. And then we get the Great Fire of 1872, and this fire started in the barn behind Boggs Barn, directly behind the Sherman House, which is the west side of 2nd Avenue between Chisholm and River. And I'll show you, I'll kind of go through this photo and the next slide photo as well, just to kind of show that. We know that northwest wind was incredibly strong during this time, and it wiped out full sections between 1st and 3rd Avenues from the river to the alley of the Masonic block. So basically stopping at 3rd. It stopped short of 1st Most buildings on the river street caught fire. You'll see in this screen, my screen's acting up a little bit, so excuse me if I'm a little blind here. See if I can get that fixed. I have a big screen as well as my laptop to help me out here. But you see in this depiction here, the picket fence in the image is where the State Theater is basically now, or what was the Maltz Opera House, but prior to that, the Maltz wasn't there yet. So about 15 acres of this region is burnt out, and that's the majority of the business part of town. And so just for reference, when you're looking at this image, you're looking at what is now the State Theater from the river view. So you're looking what would be kind of like southwesterly. So, this area burns, you lose about 15 acres of your central business district. Within several months, though, following this, we start seeing more and more brick blocks being built and less wood frame buildings being established. The Alpena Weekly Argus during this time had completely burnt out, but within about 45 days had resumed its publications. And we have a couple articles that talk about their gratitude to the community for helping them rebuild. 3 people in total are killed by a fire, and 3 others are killed by injuries. And we have a reported total loss of about $200,000 in their finances at the time in property loss. Following this fire, the city votes to increase the size of the fire department as a result, and we see the establishment of Alpena House number 2 coming into existence. So why is kind of the importance? Why is some of the importance of the fire of 1872? The fire's origin is thought to have been the result of a whiskey catching fire. This kind of plays into Alpena's early history with the temperance movement, and there's a lot of this fire is kind of used as the quote unquote, for lack of a better word, fuel to uphold the temperance movement's cause in Alpena and keep Alpena kind of a temperate place. But we also see all these brick blocks being established. After 1872 fire, we see the Potter Block, the Pack Block, FS Goodrich store, the CC Whitney store, the JT Botswick stores, and the Charles Goling Block. And because of the fires, new fire limits are set where they move much of the central business district away from the river and more onto South 2nd Avenue. And so that's why you see all these large scale brick buildings across 2nd Avenue, is they're trying to push them away from the river, away from the lumber piles and such, and why there's an effort to build buildings of a certain size and a certain building material. In the screen, you can see a view as to what you would be looking at. If you're looking at downtown Scoops, on the farthest left, that tall building on the corner of Chisholm and 2nd. You also see the Whitney Block next to that, and what you would now see as a center building. And then, you would see that as I don't know what they call it now. It's on the corner of Water and 2nd. But that's kind of the aftermath. This would have been a photo taken in 1874. I'm always happy to provide images or these slides afterwards if anyone does email me. So just to close it off, I know I can be a bit long-winded with this history, and so I really wanted to quickly, kind of end the presentation with that note, right? So, we're looking. I like this image right here because you can actually see the history of the buildings on the street. This is the old Bonds building or the Antique Mall, depending on how you talk about it. And I love this image. You have a photo on the top left. It's from the 1930s, 40s. You have a photo in the black and white. And that one's believed to be in the 1850s, which is funny because then you see color and non-color. And then you have a current photo of kind of what that space looks like. We all know the Antique Mall is being renovated by one of our local business people. And so I love to use this kind of as a comparison to see how Alpena has changed at its time. So the history of Alpena, hopefully by the end of this, you realize it's one of complexity, advantageous political movements, resulting in the incorporation of the city, and an enduring character to survive and thrive. The history of this region is sewn in the very fabric of our landscape and our buildings, and all we really need to do is take the time to search for the history embedded in them. That's what I did with this program. Often I find myself walking downtown, looking at the buildings, and they seem to kind of jump out to you and share your story. All too often, I get on multiple times a week, someone going, hey, I want to know more about this building. I want to know more about this history. And I love that part of my job is you're always learning something new. You're always finding something different. Unfortunately, we've lost, as we all know, many of these buildings and their records with them. But in the time that I started my job here at the library, I have also begun to see a renewed interest in our history of this region and the attachment to placemaking with its impacts on our buildings and landmarks. For example, what you see on the screen, what's happening with that, what happened with red brick tack room, the renewal of a building, the bringing back, cleaning it up and bringing it for future use, and also state theaters, another great example as well. It's a goal and hope of our library and myself to help preserve these histories, whether written or orally passed down, so that we all might know how special of a place Alpena is today, back then, and also for future generations too. So I hope you liked my very general, brief, jumping around presentation, but I wanted to give a little bit of history. I wanted to celebrate the 150th anniversary, which is today, and give you a little bit of history as to what resulted in the incorporation of the city, what was going on during this time as well. I highly recommend, if you have any questions, you want to learn more. I know there's a lot of books up here. Again, I'm happy to provide these slides here. These are all the books that I used to develop this program, as well as using some of our other primary resource, the newspapers and other primary source collections that we have in our care. David D. Oliver is a great publication. William Bolton's a great one. Rob Haltiner has some great kind of gleanings publications. And then you also see several different, mentionings here for Native American history and such as well. But these are really kind of the main books that I used to develop this program. So if you have more history, you're always welcome. We have most of these books in our collection. Unfortunately, you can't check these out, but you're more than welcome to make an appointment with me to come in and access these books. So I highly recommend taking the time if you are interested. My goal at the very end of the day is hopefully get someone to email me to go, hey, I want to know more about this, or hey, I'd like to come in and do more research. That really was the goal of this program, and to celebrate the anniversary. So I hope you do access these books or look them up. Some of these are for sale, not through us, but through normal avenues. But some of these are original books, so therefore not published anymore, at least. So again, thank you for joining me on this little bit of a gleanings and glide to the history of Alpena and its embodiment into the incorporation of the town. Again, my name is Don La Barre. I'm the Special Collections Librarian at the local library. You can see my phone number and extension there. You're always more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm in my office from 9 to 5 p.m. And you can get a hold of me that way or leave a message. Or you can always email us, which is usually probably the better way, because then I can actually have a written record of what I'm supposed to be looking up for you all. And that's specialcollections@alpenalibrary.org. So again, thank you so much. And so I'm going to take a quick 10 minutes or if that, I want to respect everyone's time and answer any questions. If you want to leave, that's more than fine. You can always reach out to me if you have any questions. So I'm going to quickly scan through the comments here just to see if there's any questions that came through. Okay, so I have a question from Rob Lawson. Questions for the end. David D. Oliver's legacy and source of American settlers in the lumber era. New York State, question mark. I'm assuming I answered part of that question.
Super quick, Don, on that one. And first of all, massive applause. Great. No, I just think Oliver, down in Anamickee, we have this tiny, tiny little street next to the river that's named for him. And then in town, there's a little bit longer street. I've read Oliver's book a number of years ago, and I thought, wow. I mean, I know when people are authors, you kind of make yourself the hero of your own story, but it seemed like he was so important, at least the way he portrayed himself. And I'm curious, because Oliver, other than talks like yours right now, you don't hear a lot about him. It seemed like he was really important. And then the other question, I was just curious if you've been able to glean anything about, typical of Michigan, were the people coming in the lumber era, were they mostly from New York State? So those two things. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, so in terms of that second part of the question, we see him from New York State, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. We see a large part of that workforce. When we see kind of prior to the 1850s, the lumber industry, they've exhausted East Coast pine and they need to move up. And if you look at any kind of pine land, Pennsylvania up kind of bleeds in terms of pine land into Michigan and over. So you see, as they start to exhaust the East Coast, they do move up into the Michigan area and the subsequent other areas as well. And so that workforce follows them. The businesses follow them. You see the same thing happen in 1900s when you see the pine industry exhausted in this area. Following 1900s, you see some people will diversify their business, such as the Fletcher families and other families did. Or you see people like Gilchrist. Frank Gilchrist was a huge lumber baron in this town. He takes his ventures. He goes, all right, it's done. Early 1900s, jumps over to Oregon. So you see people follow the white pine and the pine forest as they move across the west side of the state. So they're coming from all over in terms of the businessmen themselves, and the lumbermen themselves are coming from that region. They're being hired from within that area as well. They're moving up there for seasonal work and probably staying as well. So I hope that answered that part of that question. So I got a question from Anne. Can you talk at the end about Alpena City Hall and how long that has been in its current location? Honestly, that was one question that it wasn't established this early. It's outside of the scope of this timeline. So I didn't really address it here. My understanding of City Hall is not as strong as, I guess, this stuff right yet, but I do actually want to develop a program that will showcase this. Or if there's someone that's attending right now that knows the history and is confident in their presentation skills, I'm more than happy to hear them out and see if it's something they would like to present, if they already have something made up. But we do know in its current configurations, early 1900s is when we start to see that building take place. And it's got a really unique history. So I do hope to build a program that will talk about the history of the City Hall in Alpena itself, because it's a fascinating building to me. Especially not being from here and you see that. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous building with a lot of really cool history to it. Liz, will you do presentations on places we suggest? Yeah, kind of depends, but you know, most of our presentations that I can do are informed by the collections we have. So if you ask for something that I don't have materials to work off of, it can get a little tricky. But yeah, you're always welcome to reach out to us, to our email or by phone. If you have any suggestions, we're more than happy to take the feedback and see what we can do to incorporate it into future programming. I love that idea. Thank you for suggesting that. Let's see, I think I saw another question. Oh, okay, that's just Anne repeating your question. Will the recording be available? Yes, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Steve told me to do that, and I totally forgot to. The city of Alpena hosts this program through its software. We are recording this right now. Once it's recorded and we finished, we will be sent the files, and we will be uploading it to the Alpena Library's YouTube page, which we'll probably post to Facebook to announce as well. So keep an eye out for that, and this program will be available for future watching in case you missed it, or you wanted to share it, or you wanted to analyze what I said and see where you can find the holes. You know, you could definitely do that. Kevin asks, Don, does the library have any of Ann Tabor's old papers from her junior high school local history class? I know that we have Ann Tabor's. We have some of her original recordings. We also have some of her transcriptions from her recordings and such that she wrote up when she did a radio show. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but we do have Ann Tabor material. We also have some stuff from when she did her slide presentations as well. So that is available. Her audio recordings are available on our Northeast Michigan Oral History and Historic Photograph database. If you can't find it on our website at alpenalibrary.org, please just email me or phone call me, and I'll show you how to get there from there. But she does have we do have some of her material online to watch. Let's see. Roman. Yeah. Okay. So Steve's saying we figured the Roman numerals above Whiteback. I want to say about 1908. Yeah. Steve would probably know a little bit better off the top than I do. But yeah, early 1900s is when we see the City Hall in its current configuration being used. Prior to that, I don't know how the city operated, where they operated out of. I have to assume in one of the blocks or such. But I don't believe the city had an organized space truly until the City Hall was built in 1908. but yeah, I would absolutely love to do a program on that. I think that would be just a really fun one to do. Yeah, Cindy Johnson says the land for City Hall was donated by Churchill because that used to be, so the Fletcher House was eventually bought by Churchill and moved to where City Hall was, or was purchased by Churchill and became Churchill House, which later then burned down, and then later was donated by Churchill for the uses of the City Hall. And it's known as Churchill Park as part of that agreement as well. Yeah, it's the same thing with the Alpena County Library. George N. Fletcher had his office building there. Upon it burning down, he made a stipulation that it be donated for the library, and part of it was the name being incorporated. Same thing with the Churchill Park. So thank you for clarifying that, Cindy and Steve, about the City Hall. But that looks to be it on the programs. I want to respect everyone's time because, as you can tell, I can talk definitely a little bit more than needed. So again, thank you so much. If you do have any questions, I will again share my screen just for the record. Again, that is the best way to contact me, is either those two ways. Email especially, because then it helps me out. I'm not the best of hearing, so emails are always the best way to go. You're always welcome to reach out to us to find out more, and we'd love to direct you and help you in your future research projects. So again, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you all taking the time and joining on this fun program that we were able to do for the city. So thanks again, everyone.